Hey, welcome to the third hour of our program. On the line with us is David Pepper, the lawyer, writer, political activist, former elected official, adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. He served as chair of the Ohio Democratic Party between 2015 and 2021. His website's laboratoriesofautocracy.com, and I subscribe to his newsletter, Pepperspectives, which is davidpepper.substack.com, and I strongly encourage you to do the same. It's free and it's amazing. His Twitter handle is @DavidPepper. David, welcome back to the program. Your newsletter a day or two ago really tagged me. I mean, really, I thought, wow, I want to share this with my listeners. And so I passed it along to Sean and asked her to get you on the program here. And so tell us about this new, we have a problem, the damning timeline of Ohio's biggest bribery scandal.
Sure. And for those from beyond Ohio, which is most of your listeners, one of my themes is that going alongside the attack on democracy in states like Ohio is always corruption. They go together. And that's why I try and emphasize that. So, yeah, in Ohio, we had the biggest bribery scandal in our history play out in recent years. And it essentially was politicians handing over to one major utility company the regulatory body that oversees that utility company. And what I was trying to show through this timeline I put together in the video on the Substack is the company basically paid the guy who ended up being the head of the regulatory agency $4 million on the way in to him being in charge. And ultimately, that agency is what allowed the biggest bribery scandal in the history of Ohio to take place. But what I try to explain is when you look at the timeline of them forking over $4 million to this guy, it was weeks before he even applied to be the head of that agency.
Whoa.
And so the question is, how were they so confident that the guy they were essentially bribing, and they've admitted it was a bribe, was going to be in charge? And that's when you look closely at their schedules and the schedule of the newly elected governor and lieutenant governor. Well, it's because they were meeting with the elected officials who made that decision at the precise same time. They knew full well the fix was in. And in a state where people are so confused about corruption because it gets complicated, what I'm trying to do is show in the end how simple the whole scam was.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Here's $4 million. Now, we're going to make sure that you're the guy who regulates our industry, do what we want. Essentially, that's what happened, right?
Yeah, and actually, it wasn't in what I sent, but there was a day where he asked for the $4.3 million, and he sent sort of the details of it. And the next day, they said, okay, we're good. In fact, we're going to pay it all at once. And it turns out they had dinner the evening between those 2 days with the governor and with the lieutenant governor.
Oh,
well, of course, they were confident enough to send him. As I said in that Substack, who sends $4.3 million out the door hoping that the guy in a month is going to nail the interview and get the job? Nobody. Right. They clearly, in that dinner between the day that the sort of was discussed and the day they agreed to it, clearly got some assurance that this was going to be the guy. And so my hope is that this guy got indicted the other day, the one who received the $4.3 million. My hope is this is not the end of the process, that he's not the only one involved. If you have evidence that the elected officials put him in there knowing all this was happening, then this should end up being about them even more than it is about the guy who got bribed to be in charge of the agency.
So between the time he asked for the money and the time he got the money, in this 24-hour period, he had dinner with, forgive my lack of detailed knowledge of Ohio politics, but was it Mike DeWine and John Husted?
Yeah, the executives did. So he says, I want $4.3 million.
Right.
That night, the executives who were considering the $4.3 million have dinner at a fancy club in Columbus with Mike DeWine and John Husted. And the next day, they send him a message back saying, you're good for the $4.3 million. In fact, we're going to pay it as a lump sum, which they did it about a week and a half or 2 weeks later. So the dinner was with the executives. And obviously, something happened at that dinner to make them very confident that they could send the guy $4.3 million before he even applied for the position or did any interviews.
Why is nobody deposing Mike DeWine and John Husted?
Interestingly, a private suit from LA employees who were share stockholders, they are actually deposing them and subpoenaing them right now as part of a private shareholder suit. That came out the other day. My hope is that when you look at the timeline, that someone along the line, be it the executives or this guy who faces the rest of his life in jail if he doesn't get out of it, that they do start to look into DeWine and Husted. What did you discuss at that dinner? What else did you discuss? Because if you go through the timeline, they had multiple conversations with these executives. Again, somehow something with those conversations clearly made those executives confident enough that the fix was in. They gave a guy $4 million plus long before he even applied for the job. We all need to know exactly what. By the way, a conservative paper the other day, the Toledo Blade, wrote a scathing editorial saying, like I'm saying, we all need to know what Mike DeWine and John Husted were discussing with First Energy about the appointment of this guy who ultimately, is the one indicted the other day for accepting all that money on a condition of helping the company.
Are there specific policy issues at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, everything. As you would know, like everything from how much we pay in rates to a clean energy approach versus just making it, the old stuff that is costing our environment and not making us competitive. This all goes through this agency. And this is a company that didn't want change, didn't want oversight, wants to be able to get whatever it wants. And ultimately, the reason this all came out is because down the road, this agency under this guy's leadership approved legislation and overall approach is very complicated, but in the end gutted a prior Democratic governor's entire sort of 21st century clean energy plan and took us back to the Stone Ages, all while raising rates. So not only is it in theory, but it turned into the biggest bribery scandal going, but also sent Ohio's energy policy back decades. And this also in the end affects also, are we a competitive state in the 21st century, knowing that wind energy, solar, those jobs for a state like Ohio could be great because we're a manufacturing-based state, but companies like First Energy want to stop any effort to try and move into the 21st century when it comes to a broad-based energy policy. So all that's wrapped up in this. And what happens is you want an agency that's thinking about the public in a long-term vision. And what you get when you have a situation like this is an energy simply doing the bidding of the very interests it's supposed to be regulating. That's the tragedy in the end for the public of this type of thing. And they're paying for it all with higher energy rates.
I've heard people say that Ohio has some of the most corrupt politics in the nation, which is hard to imagine, when you look at like Louisiana or Mississippi or Arkansas. But one of the ways or one of the reasons that Republicans get away with it so easily in Ohio is that Mike DeWine comes across as like, a friendly, thoughtful, nerdy guy. And John Husted is he just doesn't look like evil, Is it really that simple? Or how is it that Ohioans are putting up with this?
I think that for a lot of reasons, this is where I wrote my first book, Laboratories of Autocracy. We generally don't focus on state houses, states, the power they have. And so we don't see the warning signs. I ran against Mike DeWine when he was Attorney General. I ran in 2014, a very bad year for Democrats. I can show you bids that were handled by the Attorney General's office that clearly were corrupt, that were rigged. Long-term incumbent vendors to do certain type of work replaced by companies that were created 2 days before the bid that had meetings with Mike DeWine for a year. So, dressed up in sort of the broader public face is a long pattern in Ohio of pay-to-play, rigged bids. In this case, clearly the fix-in terms of who's regulating. It's kind of become business as usual. And what happens is when enough people do it and it's all they've ever known, it becomes the way the state is run. And that's what's happened. And the tragedy is not just, corruption itself, but the MO of a state that's corrupted like this is literally to give public assets and public goods to private players like First Energy. And what does that end up doing? It means that our public outcomes disintegrate. We aren't competitive in the 21st century. Our rates are higher than they should be. We're giving away public school dollars to for-profit scams. So all along the way, the tragedy is we're all paying for it through our taxes and rates, but we're even more so paying for it through indefensibly poor outcomes because everything's being forked over to the private players at our expense.
Yeah, well, good on you, David Pepper. David Pepper, Substack.com. Be sure to check it out for highlighting this stuff. Keep on doing it, and I look forward to your next newsletter.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you're amplifying all this stuff. It gets lost too often.
I agree. It so often does, and all over the country, sadly.